to George, the curious little monkey. He must know what everything's about. Curious George, the curious little monkey. What's he up to? Let's find out.
Curious George visits a toy store. A new toy store is opening today, George, said the man with the yellow hat. Let's go downtown and see it. Maybe I'll buy you a new toy. So off they went in their little blue car. There was a crowd of children and their parents waiting to buy the toys in the new store. George, I'm going to park the car, said the man. You stay here, but don't get into trouble. George sneaked through the crowd and got to the door just as the owner was opening it. Hey, you, he shouted. Wait your turn. But George couldn't wait. There were so many toys to see. Dolls, bicycles, and games. What was that? There were lots of large hoops in many colors. He tried to pull one out of the pile, but it didn't move. So he pulled with all fours. The whole pile came tumbling down. Red, blue, green, and yellow hoops went spinning and bouncing. George tried to do the hula hoop. People laughed and pointed at him. Then George pretended to be a wheel. He rolled and rolled and rolled right into the owner. It's you again, he shouted. You're making a mess of my new store. And then he tried to grab George. He jumped up to the highest shelf. Now he was safe. Hey, look up there, shouted a little boy. It's George. Mummy, can you get me that doll with the pink dress? Asked a little girl. George picked up the doll and tossed it to the little girl. Could you get me that game, please? Asked another boy. George reached up, grabbed the game, and threw it to the boy. Gee, thanks, you're swell, said the boy. Mummy, asked a girl, may I get that puppet over there? How good that George was a monkey. He jumped off the shelf, hung onto a light, and got the puppet for the little girl. You're wonderful, she said. The children laughed and cheered. What a terrific show, shouted a little boy. Let's come back tomorrow and see George again. What's going on here? Asked the owner. He was angry. Look, Mr. Owner, said a boy, pointing up. That's a great idea to have a little monkey work for you. The owner looked up. Well, I guess it was a good idea, he said. The man with the yellow hat came over to see what was going on. It's time to come down now, George, he said. I think we've had enough monkey business for one day. But monkey business is the best business, said the owner. George came down from the shelf. Thank you, George, for making my grand opening such a success, said the owner. And here's a surprise for you. Then George and his friend waved goodbye and headed for home.
Here's to George, the curious little monkey. He's so full of curiosity. Here's to George, the curious little monkey. He's as curious can be.
Curious George goes apple picking. George, said the man with the yellow hat, it's apple picking time. Let's take a ride into the country. Soon, they came to the apple farm.
"This looks like a good place," said the man. "These apples look as if they've just been picked." A crowd of people were waiting in line to buy apples. A boy named Keith and a girl named Carol were standing nearby looking very sad. "We wanted to pick apples," Carol said, "but the owner says we're too young." "Maybe you can try again next year," said the man with the yellow hat. And then he got in line to buy some apples. Then he turned to George. "You can look around," he said, "but don't get into trouble." George wandered off. There was a large dump truck with lots of apples in it. The owner of the farm was giving orders to her helpers. "Let's get those apples into the truck," she said. The helpers took the baskets of apples they had picked and put them into the back of the truck. The door to the truck was open. While no one was looking, there were 2 levers sticking up from the floor. What were they for? George was curious. The helpers were just lifting the last bushel basket of apples into the truck. "Okay," said the owner. "It's full. Close it up." George pulled one of the levers. Before the helpers could close the back, it started to lift up. George had pulled the dumping lever. The back lifted up higher and higher. Apples started rolling out. "Who's opened the back of the truck?" cried the owner. More apples came pouring out. They bounced and rolled all over. Apples were everywhere. The driver of the truck came running over. "What's happened here?" he asked. "I was just about to take the apples to the market." The owner was angry. "Look at the mess," she cried. "What are we going to do?" George was scared. He jumped out of the truck and ran away. "There he goes," cried the driver. "It's that monkey." And he started to run after him, followed by the owner and then the helpers. Quickly, George climbed one of the apple trees and disappeared into the branches. He was safe. When he looked down, he saw Carol and Keith standing near the tree. They had some empty baskets with them. "Boy," said Keith, "if we could only get to those apples up there, we'd show them." George picked up one apple and dropped it into the basket. The children looked up. "It's George," Carol cried. "Maybe you can help us." How good that George was a monkey. He could pick apples with 4 hands. "Wow," cried Keith, "it's raining apples." George picked so many apples that Carol had to run back for more baskets. Finally, the whole tree was picked. There were 25 bushels full. "We're done, George," shouted Keith. Suddenly, George saw the driver of the truck, the owner, and the helpers rush over. The owner was shaking her fist. "So you're the one who caused all the trouble," she yelled. "Come on down at once." "Wait," cried Keith. "Look at all the apples George picked." Then the owner saw the bushels. "And I thought we'd never pick those high ones," she said. "Nice work, George. I guess that makes up for dumping all those apples. Why don't you take a bushel for yourself?" "And you both did some nice work too," she said. "I'll hire you after all." Just then, the man with the yellow hat came to pick up George. And off they drove back home.
Here's to George, the curious little monkey. He's so full of curiosity. Here's to George, the curious little monkey. He's as curious can be.
Curious George and the organ grinder. "There's a street festival today, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "Let's go and have a look." They got into their little blue car and drove to the city. There were crowds of people in the street. Music was playing and the smell of many different foods filled the air. "Stay right here while I park the car," said the man, "and don't get into trouble." There was Mr. Carvelli, the organ grinder, with his little friend Pepe. Pepe was a monkey just like George, only smaller. He wore a red cap and was holding a shiny tin cup in one hand. On his other hand, he was wearing 2 finger cymbals. When Mr. Carvelli played the organ, Pepe danced. but very few people dropped coins into his tin cup. George hadn't seen another monkey for a long time. Neither had Pepe. While Mr. Carvelli turned to talk with some children, George and Pepe wandered off together. Soon, they came to a fruit stand filled with oranges, apples, and bananas. Just the thing for two hungry monkeys. The owner of the stand was busy and didn't see them. George sneaked over, reached up, and grabbed a big bunch of yellow bananas. When the fruit man turned around, he saw the two monkeys. "Hey, you're stealing my fruit," he shouted. "Grab them," cried the man. George and Pepe disappeared into the crowd. Now they were safe. Finally, they sat down on a bench and started to eat their bananas. Pepe put his tin cup between George and himself. People started gathering around. Pepe clicked his little cymbals, and George got up and danced. "Look at those cute monkeys," said a man, and dropped 2 silver coins into Pepe's tin cup. Soon, George and Pepe were surrounded by a crowd of people. Pepe kept clicking away, and George kept dancing. Lots of coins were dropped into his tin cup. There were so many coins in the cup that they fell on the ground. Pepe took off his red cap and put it down. More coins were dropped in. "George, Pepe, there you are!" It was Mr. Carvelli, the organ grinder. The fruit man came rushing over, too. "They stole my fruit," he shouted. "But they're giving us a good show," said a lady in the crowd. "Don't be too angry with them. Look at all the money they made." "Angry?" said Mr. Carvelli. "It looks as if they collected more coins today than I did in a week." Then Mr. Carvelli took some money and gave it to the fruit man. "This will pay for the bananas," he said. "Well, I guess that settles that," said the fruit man. Mr. Carvelli turned to George. "You can join us anytime," he said. "You two make a good team." Just then, the man with the yellow hat came through the crowd. "I've been looking all over for you, George," he said. "Looks like you've had a busy day." They waved goodbye, got in their little blue car, and drove back home.
Curious George, the curious little monkey. Oh, what fun to run and jump and play. Curious George, the curious little monkey. Let's go see what he's doing today.
Curious George visits the dentist. "Ouch," said the man with the yellow hat. "I've got a bad toothache. I must go and see the dentist. George, come and keep me company." George and his friend got into their little blue car and went to see Dr. Huggins. "Dr. Huggins will take you right away," said a woman at the front desk. "Just follow the nurse." "George, sit in the waiting room and read a book," said the man, "and don't get into trouble." A little girl and her mother were also waiting. The little girl looked unhappy. "I don't want to go in there," she said. "Now, Melissa," said her mother, "let Dr. Huggins look at your teeth. She won't hurt you." "I don't like those machines in there," she said. "They make scary noises." The nurse came back to the waiting room. "We're all ready, Mrs. Campbell," she said. "Would Melissa like to go in first?" "Now, dear," said Mrs. Campbell, "there's nothing to worry about. I'll go first, and you can wait here with George." So Mrs. Campbell left with the nurse. George picked up a book and started to read. But after a while, he got restless. The nurse had left the door to the examining room slightly open. George sneaked in.
The nurse was putting lots of cotton into Mrs. Campbell's mouth. Then she left the room. Mrs. Campbell was sitting on a strange-looking chair. It had levers and knobs and pedals. How did that chair work? George was curious. He went over and pulled one of the levers. The chair started to rise. George pulled another one. The chair went down. He turned a knob, and the chair went backwards. He stepped on a pedal, and the chair turned around. George gave Mrs. Campbell quite a ride, but Mrs. Campbell didn't want her ride. Melissa had come to the door of the examining room to see what was going on. What fun! Melissa began to smile. Just then, the nurse came back. "You get away from that chair, George," she shouted. Quickly, she fixed the chair and tried to make Mrs. Campbell comfortable. But Mrs. Campbell was angry. "Someone grab that monkey," she shouted. "He's bothering me." "I'll go and get Dr. Huggins in here right away," said the nurse. George was scared and hid behind the chair. "What's going on here?" asked the doctor. "It's that little monkey down there," said the nurse. Suddenly, somebody laughed out loud. It was Melissa. "I think George is so funny," she said. "When can I get into that chair? I want a ride, too." Dr. Huggins smiled. Mrs. Campbell smiled, too. "George," she said, "you caused a lot of trouble today, but you did stop Melissa from being afraid of the dentist." Just then, the man with the yellow hat came in. "Come on, George," he said. "I have made an appointment for my next visit. We'll let Dr. Huggins take care of Melissa now." Then George and his friend drove back home in their little blue car.
Here's to George, the curious little monkey. He's so full of curiosity. Here's to George, the curious little monkey. He's as curious can be.
Curious George on the ice. "I have work to do, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "Why don't you go out and build a snowman? But don't get into trouble." People were having lots of fun in the snow. Mr. Nelson and his family were building a snowman. Peter was putting on a carrot for a nose, and Susan had 2 big black coals for the eyes. There was an old black hat lying in the snow. George grabbed it, jumped up, and tried to put the hat on the snowman. "Look what you've done," shouted Peter. "You've ruined our snowman," cried Susan. George ran to the frozen pond at the bottom of the hill. A lot of boys and girls were skating on the ice playing hockey. One team was trying to make the puck go into the net on the other side. But a goalie guarded the net with his stick and tried to keep the puck out. Maybe George could play too. Look, there went the puck. George ran after it and stopped it with his feet. The skaters were coming after him. But George knew what to do. He kicked the puck and he lost his balance and slid right into the other skaters. "Stop him," they shouted. But George was busy kicking the puck toward the goalie. But he lost his balance again and slid past the goalie right into the net. Now he was trapped. The whole team skated over to George. "Go away and don't bother us," shouted one of the players. "You don't even know how to skate." George slid over to the other side of the pond, climbed up a tree, and watched the younger children play a different game called the whip. They held hands and skated round and round in a circle. The children on the outside had to skate so fast that the last girl on the line lost her hold and flew across the ice way to the other side where the ice was thin. "Help," she cried. "It's icy and I can't get out." How good that George was a monkey. He moved along a branch, reached down, and pulled her out. The hockey players, the children, and the man with the yellow hat saw what George had done. "Hooray!" they all shouted. "You're a real hero." "Next time, we might even let you be the goalie," said one of the players. "But," said the man with the yellow hat, "you'd better learn how to skate first." George waved goodbye to his new friends, and he and the man went home.
Here's to George, the curious little monkey. He must know what everything's about. Curious George, the curious little monkey. What's he up to? Let's find out.
Curious George visits the old town. "They're having a celebration in the old section of town today, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "Let's go." They got into their little blue car and drove off. Horses were pulling old carriages, and tourists were visiting the old-fashioned shops. "Come on, George, let's see what's going on there," said the man. A lady in an old fancy costume was standing in front of the blacksmith shop. "Many years ago, they shoed the horses here," she said. This was where the blacksmith forged the metal for the horseshoes. He kept the fire going by using the bellows to blow air on it. George was watching. How did the bellows work? He was curious. When the lady took the tourists to the other side of the shop, George stayed behind. He went to the brick oven, picked up the bellows, and squeezed it. A gust of air came out. George kept on squeezing. On the top of the table was a pile of paper. One squeeze, and they all went flying. Then George sneaked to the group of tourists. Another squeeze, and the ashes from a man's pipe flew all over. One more squeeze, and off flew the lady's fancy wig. "What's going on here?" shouted the man with the pipe. "Who's doing this?" yelled someone else. "It's that monkey," said another tourist. "Let's catch him." He dashed out the door and ran down the street. Everybody ran after him. But George disappeared around a corner. A horse and carriage were standing in front of a restaurant. The driver was having lunch. George leaped up and hid under a blanket. A little boy named Robert was feeding some sugar to the horse. He climbed up and sat in the driver's seat. "Giddy up," he shouted. The horse heard him and trotted out into the road. Just then, a car was coming from a side street. The horse was scared. More horns blew. "Look out," a driver shouted. "A runaway horse." "Help," cried Robert. He was scared. George stuck his head out and looked around. The driver of the carriage came out of the restaurant and ran after them. "Pull on the reins," he shouted. "That'll stop the horse."
Robert couldn't find the reins. They were dragging on the ground. But George knew what to do. He leaped onto the horse's back, gathered up the reins, and pulled as hard as he could. Soon, the horse stopped. The driver came running over. "Are you all right?" he asked Robert. "Yes, thanks to George," said Robert. "Nice going, George," said the driver, and shook George's hand. Just then, the angry lady guide came running over, followed by the man with the pipe, followed by the man with the yellow hat. "So there you are, you little rascal," she said. "Don't punish him," interrupted the driver. "He may have been naughty, but he did save the little boy by stopping the horse." "You're right," said the lady. "Surely the boy is more important than my wig." "Hooray for George!" yelled one of the tourists, and everybody clapped. "It's time to go home, George," said the man with the yellow hat. And so they did.
Curious George, the curious little monkey. Here he comes, as happy as can be. Curious George, the curious little monkey. Why is he curious? Well, let's go and see.
Curious George and the maple syrup. "It's maple syrup time, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "Let's go to the country and get some more for our pancakes." They got into their little blue car and went off to a farm near the forest. Mr. McIver was standing by the barn. "This is good weather for maple syrup," he said. "But it's bad for the cattle. They can get stuck in the mud." George looked around for the maple syrup, but he did not see any. "Look in the woods, George," said Mr. McIver. "You'll see plenty of syrup there." "But remember," said the man with the yellow hat, "don't get into trouble." George walked down the trail. He saw some trees that had buckets hanging from their trunks. What were the buckets for? George was curious. He climbed up a tree to take a good look. Someone had made a hole in the tree, and the syrup was dripping into the bucket. So that's where maple syrup comes from. George tasted it. It was delicious. He tasted some more. Then he helped himself to a whole bucket. And another. And another. Maybe he shouldn't have had so much syrup. Now his tummy hurt. A while later, Mr. McIver's children, Brian and Mary, came down the trail to empty the buckets. "Look," cried Mary. "Someone took all the syrup. There's nothing left." "It must have been that monkey up there," shouted Brian. "Let's get him." George was scared. Suddenly, there was a loud mooing sound. A cow was stuck in a mud hole. Help was needed, and fast. Luckily, there was a tractor near a barn. George ran over, jumped on the seat, and blew the horn as loud as he could. The children came running over. "It's him again," cried Mary. "Now George is fooling around with the tractor." "Don't worry, I'll catch him," shouted Brian, and tried to grab him. But George jumped off the tractor, ran to the mud hole, and jumped on the cow. The cow mooed again. "What's that?" Mary asked. "Sounds like a cow in trouble," Brian said. "Maybe that's why George blew the horn." "Let's get Dad," shouted Mary, and they ran back to the house. Meanwhile, the cow was sinking deeper in the mud. George ran back to the barn, found a heavy rope, and ran back to the cow. Then he tied the rope around the cow's horns. Mr. McIver came over just in time. "Throw me that rope, George," he shouted. Then he tied the rope to the tractor. The children cheered. "Thanks, George," said Mr. McIver. "Hooray for George! He's great," Mary shouted. "George, you shouldn't have taken all that maple syrup, but you made up for it by saving our cow." "George, I've been looking all over for you," said the man with the yellow hat. "Let's go home." And that's just what they did.
Here's to George, the curious little monkey. He's so full of curiosity. Here's to George, the curious little monkey. He's as curious can be.
Curious George goes to the post office. "I need some stamps, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "Let's go to the post office." They got in their little blue car and drove off. Soon, they arrived at the post office. There was a long line of people waiting at the window. "This is terrible," said the postmaster to his helper. "The machine just broke and you'll have to stamp all the letters by hand." "I'll have to wait here for a while, George," said the man with the yellow hat. "You look around, but don't get into trouble." George wandered off and went into another room full of mail bags. Mailmen were putting letters into little slots. After a while, they stopped and went to get coffee. George walked up to the shelves and looked at the letters. Could he be a mailman? George was curious. He picked up some letters, then he went to work. How good that George was a monkey. Wherever there was an empty slot, he stuck in a letter. He worked so fast that soon he had finished the whole stack of mail. The coffee break was over, and all the mailmen returned to work. "What's going on?" shouted a mailman. "All the letters are in the wrong place. Now we'll have to do the whole thing over. Who made this mess?" "It's that monkey," shouted another. "Let's get him." George leaped over the shelves and hid in an open bag that was used for packages. A mailman came running over. "Where is he?" he shouted, but he did not see him. When the coast was clear, George stuck his head out. George was safe. He could see the counter where the clerk had been stamping the letters. George jumped up on the counter and picked up 2 stampers. Then he started stamping almost as fast as a machine. Suddenly, someone grabbed him from behind. "Now I've got you," shouted the mailman. George was scared. He tried to get away, but the mailman held on to him. The postmaster came running over, followed by the mailman. "So you're the little fellow who mixed up all the letters," he said. "Let's get him out of here," said a mailman. "Wait," said the postmaster. "I think I have a better idea." "George," said the postmaster, "I'm going to give you another chance." He gave George a big pile of letters. "Let's see how fast you can stamp these," he said. George took the stampers and started working with all 4s. In a little while, the whole pile was finished. "Good work," said the postmaster. "This makes up for the mess you made with all the letters." Finally, the man with the yellow hat had reached the counter. "You sure speeded things up, George," he said. "Now we can go home." George shook hands with the postmaster. And he and his friend drove off in their little blue car.
George, the curious little monkey. Here he comes, as happy as can be. Curious George, the curious little monkey. Why is he curious? Well, let's go and see.
Curious George goes to a bowling alley. Let's go to the new bowling alley, George, said the man with the yellow hat. The famous bowler, Lois Taylor, is giving a demonstration. The newspaper reporters and the TV cameraman will be there. They got in their little blue car and off they went to the bowling alley. A crowd of people was standing around a TV camera. You can go and watch, George, said the man. But remember, don't get into trouble. How did they make a television program? George was curious. He tried to see what was going on. Above the crowd was a long pole with a microphone at the end. George leaped up and landed on the pole. Now we could see what was going on. A reporter was talking to the famous bowler. The crowd was all around them. George leaned down to get a better look. He leaned over a little too far. The microphone's tipping, the cameraman cried. George slid down the pole and landed on Lois Taylor, the famous bowler. Get him out of here, cried the reporter. He's interrupting my program. He's spoiling my grand opening, shouted Mr. Manelli. Somebody catch him. By now, everyone was shouting or laughing, or trying to catch George. George slipped through the reporter's legs, dodged in and around the people, and ran to the nearest bowling lane. At the end of the lane was a strange machine. It was the pin setter, a good place for George to hide. Let's start the demonstration, said the owner. I hope nothing else goes wrong. Now the crowd could watch Lois Taylor. She picked up her bowling ball, aimed carefully, and rolled it down the lane toward the pins. All 10 pins went flying. Everyone clapped. The ball came back, and the famous bowler picked it up. She had to wait until the machine scooped up the pins and set them down again. But the machine didn't move. Oh no, cried Mr. Manelli, the pin setter must be broken. He pushed several buttons, but nothing happened. The machine just didn't work. Lois Taylor was angry. How can I give a demonstration if the pin-setting machine doesn't work, she asked, and walked off. Mr. Manelli was angry, too. What am I going to do now, he asked. Wait, someone cried. Look down there. Everybody looked. The pins were being picked up, but not by the machine. 4 hands reached down and set them in their places. It was George. Now the famous bowler could bowl again. George was faster than any pin-setting machine. Great! A monkey for a pin boy, shouted the reporter. Let's get him on TV. Good idea, said the cameraman. We'll interview George with Lois Taylor. After the game, Mr. Manelli shook George's hand. Thanks, George, he said. I was mad at you for playing around with the microphone, but you made up for it by helping Lois Taylor finish her game. Well, George, said the man with the yellow hat, you didn't get a chance to bowl, but it looks as if you'll be on TV. And so he was.